one time.
Oh, goodness.
Wow.
That's a lot. Huh. Well, huh. Now we're happy to have one.
You are. I'm not.
Well, I would prefer more, but
No,
It's better than
I
zero.
made a fairway shopper out of me.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? To have a fairway.
Yeah. Fairway started in Iowa also, in Boone.
Yeah.
My mom, I remember as a little kid, she used to shop in the grocery store on the north side of the square. There was one right in the middle of the block.
Lanes.
Lanes, and she would complain if her bag of groceries cost more than $1.50. She says, it's just highway robbery, I've gotta go to Hutchins and Diagonal. Which she always paid more.
Yeah, Art Blaine was there for many years. I think he sold out in 58 or 59 to Glenn and Doris Hutchison.
They had an interesting thing, they had the big roll of paper and the string coming down to the counter. You bought a lot of things, and they wrapped a lot of it to send it home with you, and then you just signed your receipt, and they'd send you a bill once a month.
Yeah, grocery shopping was different in the old
Oh,
days.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, well.
Well, since I turned my phone off, I don't have a clock. All right. My name's Mike Abbott. I'm a Ringgold County historian. There might be others, I don't know. And I am a member of the Mount Air Depot Museum, one of the curators. And I specialize in paper, especially photographs, but I also like advertising paper like matchbooks, business cards, calendars, ticket stubs, ink blotters. Remember ink blotters? So there's a lot of fun stuff in the paper world. I'll talk to you today about early grocery stores. And I read the old newspapers quite often. And you really get, after doing it for 20 years, you start to get a feel for what it was like back then. And sometimes you try to imagine what it was like back then, and you just can't. For example, Ringgold County was established in 1855. Where those folks got their provisions, I do not know. But I know this. In 1857, the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad got as far as Ottumwa. That's about a 4 days ride from here. And the pioneers would take their buckboard and go the 4 days to Ottumwa, load up, 4 days back. That was the bad news. The good news is St. Joseph, Missouri got the railroad in 1859, which put us about a half a day closer, well, more than that, probably a full day closer to Ringgold County. So now people were going to St. Joe, Missouri with their buckboards and bringing back provisions. And a lot of the early stuff involved coffee, which you couldn't get anywhere else, and flour, because grist mills were not yet in existence in the 1850s. In fact, pre-Civil War was very basic. There was an early grist mill in Westerville in Decatur County, and there was an early grist mill in Marina in Ringgold County, which would be north of Diagonal. And so grinding wheat and corn is very important. You couldn't do much without meal. You needed the bread for bulk and calories, and if you couldn't grind wheat, it was a tough diet back then. And they did things that we don't do, like we don't shoot and eat animals during the summer. I guarantee you they did back then. So having the railroad as close as St. Joe was a really good deal. 10 years later, 1869, Afton got the railroad, and now it was a 1 day ride. And there was a hack line. A guy went up one day, came back the next, went back up the next day, came back the next, and he took passengers, but mostly mail, mail was the real reason for that hack line, but also pick up provisions and people get off the train in Afton and ride back down to Mount Air with the hack line. So that was a pretty good deal to have a train one day away. 1871, Bedford got the railroad and Leon got the railroad. So if you lived in those parts of the county, you go to Bedford or Leon. And then you could get whatever you wanted. But it was a pretty tough go, especially pre-World War, Civil War. I don't know. I don't think they had very long life expectancy. You know, over the years, retail shopping for food changed quite a bit. And I used to love to read about butcher shops because they were not always pleasant places. You know, meat was either canned or dried or salted or smoked for preservation purposes. But slaughterhouses were usually gross places to even see from a distance. But I was fascinated by butcher shops. Then butcher shops disappeared. Why? Refrigerated meat cases, which came into Ringgold County in 1930. So now grocery stores could have refrigerated meat cases, and it made the butcher shop obsolete. Same with the bakery. We had lots of bakeries, and they're fun to read about because they made pies and cakes and all things that get me excited. But bread delivery started about 1939, 1940, 41. So bread was coming from Des Moines and bigger bakeries and by truck. And so the bakeries went away. And that's just the natural process of things. They were no longer necessary. In the early history of Hy-Vee, there's three major players: Charles Hyde, David Vredenberg, and the General Supply Company. The General Supply Company was a business started in Lamoni in 1903. And I don't think they incorporated till 1922. But Hy-Vee was really born out of the General Supply Company. And why Decatur County and Lamoni doesn't claim more credit for starting Hy-Vee, I don't know, because they could sure make that claim. David Vredenberg and Charles Hyde were both from northern Harrison County, Iowa. And the towns up in there are Logan, Magnolia, Little Sioux, Woodbine, there's another one. And David Vredenberg appears to have been in retail his whole life. But Charles Hyde had tried his hand at farming, didn't work out. He started working at part-time for David Vredenberg. They had a store, and in the beginning, the grocery stores also sold dry goods. And so David Vredenberg and Charles Hyde probably met at church. They were both members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So Hyde was working for Vredenberg. Vredenberg had another partner at that time. His name was Archie Lewis. And it wasn't just in that store. In 1920, before David Vredenberg moved to Lamoni, Archie Lewis and David Vredenberg had a grocery store in Hatfield, Missouri. And it lasted until 1921. And Archie Lewis was also a member of the RLDS church. So David Vredenberg had a partner before Charles Hyde. 1922, David Vredenberg moves to Lamoni and took the position of general manager of the General Supply Company. The General Supply Company was a food warehouse that supplied a small chain of its own stores. It was a franchise. And so David Vredenberg and Charles Hyde both ended up working for a company where they would learn the ropes of a franchise retail outlet. And in fact, they would eventually take over the holdings of the General Supply Company, and it became Hy-Vee. But there's a lot that happened in between. There's the Hatfield thing. General Supply Company incorporated in 1922. Another guy came from Magnolia. At that time, his name was Ralph Travis, and he became the secretary of the General Supply Company, and he would later become a manager of Hy-Vee. So things evolved, but all the mechanisms were in place because of the General Supply Company. Charles Hyde lived in Ringgold County on 2 occasions. He lived in Mount Ayr in 1923 and 24. The General Supply Company opened a branch store in Mount Ayr in the old Tembe building on the southeast corner of the square. And Charles Hyde and a guy named Roy Foreman came to stock that store, manage it, invoice, inventory, because they closed the store in Decatur City, and brought the goods to Mount Ayr and started a store here. Now, I think the railroads have a lot to do with where they located. Lamoni and Mount Ayr, same railroad line. And I'll touch on that a little bit later with the first 2 Hy-Vee stores. They were on the same railroad line, 8 miles apart. So, where was I? Charles Hyde lived in Mount Ayr in 1923 and 24. And he was training Roy Foreman how to be a manager. So when Charles Hyde got done there, 1924, he went back to work at Lamoni. Charles Hyde became an expert meat cutter. He was the manager of the meat business for the General Supply Company. And then something happened that I haven't figured out all the way. In 1925, Charles Hyde bought a grocery store in Cameron, Missouri. Now that was not on the Burlington. A little bit later we're going to see that the General Supply Company did have a store there, but Charles Hyde seems to have left the General Supply Company in order to buy that store in Cameron. I don't know why he went there, because 6 months later, the newspaper says he had moved back to Pisgah, Iowa, which is in northern Harrison County. He was from there, his wife was from there. Their firstborn was a son. He died when he was about 15, childhood diabetes. So I don't know if the son was still living and he was sick, but anyway, Charles Hyde left the General Supply Company and went back to Pisgah. 1927, the General Supply Company eliminated dry goods and hardware from their inventory and just focused on groceries. Remember, the 20s were a pretty good era for business. Money was good, things were improving, highway systems were getting, the highways really took off in the late 20s. They started to get graded and paved and marked, and a lot of progress was being made on the highway system in the late 20s. But truck delivery, trucks, after World War I, delivery trucks were used some, but highways were still pretty bad until the late 20s. So I think most shipments came by rail, and should have, because rail service was good in the 20s. That would be the last decade it was good. So 1927, and I don't know what prompted, David Friedenberg talked him into it, I don't know. Charles Hyde moves from Pisgah to Kellerton and bought a grocery store. He was half owner. The General Supply Company was the other half owner. The store's name was Hyde's, not General Supply Company. So Charles Hyde lived in Kellerton from 1927 to 1933. They moved a week after his daughter Hortense graduated from Kellerton High School in 1933. And I think Charles Hyde wanted to move before that, but Hortense You can tell in the newspaper she had a lot of parties, slumber parties. Her girlfriends from high school, she was very tight with them, and she didn't want to go finish high school in Lamoni. So they stayed in Kellerton until 1933. She graduates, they go straight to Lamoni. And Charles Hyde took the meat cutting business at the General Supply Company, but his store remained in Kellerton, and it was still called Hyde's. It was just run by other managers. And here's the thing about Hy-Vee. There are two Hy-Vee books. One was written in 1989 and one in 2004. And they don't say this specifically, but if you look up all the people that Hy-Vee hired, they only hired within their church. They did not hire people who were not members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today we would call that homophobia and racism, and you don't like brown people, and 100 other names. You know what it was called in 1930? Success. Because remember what I said, they started Hy-Vee on the very doorstep of the Great Depression in the smallest town in Ringgold County in the middle of the winter. Now that's according to Hy-Vee's history. I have my own. It's a little different. So, we can jump ahead to that now. Hy-Vee says they started in February, in between January and March 1930. And when I first read that, I go, that's not right. Beaconsfield? Right after the Great Depression started? That's not right. Well, the newspapers are digitized and online, so I can do some research. The bad news is no Kellerton newspapers, no Grand River newspapers. Both of those newspapers covered Beaconsfield news. But I did get a little bit of information from the Tingley Vindicator and the Mount Air Record News, because they had correspondence as supply news from Beaconsfield. Vredenburg and Hyde's name never came up in 1929 or 30. General Supply Company, that came up. The first manager of the store in Beaconsfield was Cecil and Alice Knopfsker. They were from Lamoni. They moved to Beaconsfield on October 4th, 1929. The stock market crash was October 29, 28, 27? So
29, yep.
So the first manager moves to Beaconsfield on October 4th, 1929. If the store never opened, wouldn't he have moved back? He stayed in Beaconsfield all winter. I know that because the correspondent column would say, Alice Knopfsker went to Lamoni to visit relatives and came back the next day. So I know they were there all winter. Here's what I think. I think the first Hy-Vee store opened a week or two the stock market crash. And it was too late to pull back because Hyde and Vredenburg had already borrowed the money. They had already purchased the stock. They already hired the manager and moved him there. I mean, if they hadn't opened yet, wouldn't they say, hey, Cecil, go home, we're going to wait this out a little bit because things are really scary right now. But they didn't do that. I think they opened before the stock market crash, a week or two. As Cecil got there October 4th, 2 weeks to do inventory, invoice, get familiar with the community. 1 week, I don't know, but I think they opened in October 29. I do know this also. The Beaconsfield Bank was started by a man from Lamoni. Ackersley was his name. And as I'm reading the bank board of trustees and all of that in Beaconsfield, those were Lamoni names. That bank was owned by members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I think they borrowed their money from the Beaconsfield Bank. Now, in Beaconsfield's behalf, it was on the upswing. They were getting electricity. There was a new high school in the process of being built, a brick school. And they did get finished in 1930. And so Beaconsfield was kind of on the upswing. Now, I guess I knew that store number 2 was in Grand River. Grand River's on the same railroad line, 8 miles away from Beaconsfield, but in a different county, in Decatur County, where Lamoni is in Decatur County. So that store was purchased by a guy named Ellis Bedwell, and David Breedenberg bought that store from the General Supply Company in January 1930. January 1930. July 1930. So about 8 months after the Beaconsfield store opened. And I thought that was a pretty bold move on Breedenberg's part. I don't know anything about the Ellis Bedwell guy, but in January 1931, so 6 months after they bought the Grand River store, Breedenberg bought out his partner. So now it was just Breedenberg's. Now Breedenberg and Hyde both used the name General Supply Store, even with the stores they owned. Hy-Vee wasn't used till 1952. So they would call their stores Hyde's, or Breedenberg's, or Hyde and Breedenberg's, or General Supply Store. People were familiar with the name General Supply Store. So store number 2 was in Grand River, just like 8 or 9 months after the Beaconsfield store opened. So now they had a franchise. It takes 2. I forget, Hy-Vee calls, I think they call Kingsville store number 3. But I told you earlier that the store in Kellerton was half owned by Charles Hyde and half by the General Supply Company. David Breedenberg left the General Supply Company in 1932. And later I'll give you a list of what Hy-Vee gives as its stores in order, and how I disagree with that. You know, in the 1940 Lamoni Chronicle is a brief history of Hy-Vee, and there is some pertinent information in there. I'd have to know a lot more about the inner workings of the General Supply Company before I could have more information than I do now. In 1928, Mount Air newspaper gives a list of the stores owned by the General Supply Company and who their managers were. Kellerton, Charlie Hyde. Mount Air, Roy Foreman. Roy Foreman was still there. Allerton, Ralph Travis. Ralph Travis came from Pisgah, Magnolia, northern Harrison County. In 1922, he was the first secretary of the General Supply Company after they filed articles of incorporation in 1922. Lineville, Clarence Braby. Now, we grew up with Braby's. I thought Braby was a Ringgold name. They're actually from Decatur County. They had the good fortune to migrate to Ringgold County. Garden Grove, Joe Carr. Pleasanton, Frank Reeves. And Lamoni, David Breedenberg. What they got? 8 stores at that time. 7. They had 7 stores. So the supply store had 7 stores in 1928. Here's the list of Hy-Vee stores that Hy-Vee gives in order and the dates that the store came into existence. Beaconsfield says January or February 1930. And I told you how I already disagreed with that, but if I could ever get the Kellerton and Grand River newspapers, and someday I might, they might be on, the publisher of the Kellerton paper, his name was Bert Ballou, and he was kind of a no-frills guy. He didn't make the booklets of the year's papers like a lot of newspapers do. He just put them in a shed out back, and the roof blew off and they got wet, and his grandkids threw them away. That's what one of his grandkids told me. So If I ever get the Grand River newspapers, that'll be helpful. I don't know that they survived either. A long time ago, there was a publisher of the Grand River newspaper named Horace Greeley. And supposedly he was a cousin of the Horace Greeley from Ohio that popularized the phrase, "Go West, young man." So Beaconsfield, January, February 1930. That store only lasted until July 1933. That store, the stock, got loaded up and moved to Princeton, Missouri. And this was the first time that Hy-Vee was located in a county seat, and also the first time located on a railroad other than the Burlington. So this was the Rock Island that Princeton was on. Store number 2, Grand River, July 1930. July 1930 is when Breedenberg bought out his partner, and then he was sole owner of that store. And that store supposedly lasted until 1937. Store number 3, according to Hy-Vee, was Canesville, which was on the Burlington, and it started in May 1930. That's completely foreign to me. I haven't found any evidence of that, although I will look for it now. And it says that store didn't close till May 1979, which is pretty late. I mean, Canesville's got a school. It's not like they're non-existent, but Ridgeway is store number 4, and I believe that because I know that David Breedenberg spent a lot of time in Ridgeway, even when he was working for the General Supply Company. You get into the digitized newspapers and they have a word search feature, and you can type in Breedenberg. There were some Breedenbergs in Lamoni, but there were no Hydes. When you type in Hyde, you get Charles Hyde. So they're pretty easy to research in the Lamoni Chronicle and the Mount Air paper, but they don't appear very often in the Mount Air paper. Store number 5 is Kellerton, 1932, Lineville, 1932, Lamoni, 1932. 1932 is when David Breedenberg left the General Supply Company, and they acquired these stores from the General Supply Company. But I Googled General Supply Company, they were still in operation in the late 40s. So the incorporated business of the General Supply Company stayed in business, although they might have been just a warehouse or just a retail store. They no longer were franchised, but they were still in existence. Princeton, 1933. I started to tell you, the Beaconsfield store moved to Princeton in 1933. The interesting thing about that was the managers at the time, Mr. and Mrs. Dale Gammett. Charles Hyde's mother's name, maiden name, was Gammett. So I think it was his cousin. Now they kept it in the family as best they could. But like I said, it spelled success for them. They did what other people couldn't do. Also in that 1940 article that gives a brief history of Hy-Vee, it talks about the different skill sets that Hyde and Breedenberg had that, made for a full package when you put them together. It says David Breedenberg had an old Ford pickup, and that he would drive to Des Moines, Ottumwa, St. Joe to pick up supplies and deliver them to the stores. But I guess that's on top of the railroad deliveries. But after the stock market crashed, rail service began to go downhill. And in fact, the railroads wanted to abandon a lot of these smaller branch lines, but the Interstate Commerce Commission, they were tough on them. And then when the war came, World War II, the ICC said nobody is abandoning any rail, you will stay in operation. So, but by the late 30s, delivery was getting, highways were good, delivery trucks were good and refrigerated, and things began to move along there. Hyde and Breedenberg were both very hard workers, very smart guys, very dedicated and devoted to their mission and to their church. I kept looking for evidence that there was some kind of ill feeling toward Hyde and Breedenberg for abandoning the General Supply Company, which was purely RLDS Church. I never found any of that. And so they were successful, and they started with very little, and but they were both in their late 40s when the first Hy-Vee opened, so they had a lot of experience by then. And I guess if you're in your late 40s, you can still work hard. I don't think I did, but I know I don't now. But it's just, you know, if you got the know-how and the willingness, you can make it happen, and they did. And in the beginning, I told you they only hired RLDS people. They only hired married couples to be their managers. And one of them was there all the time. In the old days, stores opened early and stayed open late. It was a full-time job. The Mount Air Hy-Vee, I'll give you some info on that. So, I told you that the General Supply store opened here in 1923, and they moved around 1927, 28 to the north side of the square, and that store became Art Lane's grocery store. Art Lane was also a member of the RLDS Church, but it stopped being General Supply Company and became Art Lane's store. And in 1947, Charles Hyde opened a grocery store where Morgan Waldire has her building now. And that became Hyde's Food Store, because it wasn't 52 yet. They weren't using the name Hy-Vee. They were still using Hyde's or Breedenberg's or Hyde and Breedenberg's. So it was called Hyde's Food Store, and it opened in, I think, September, October 1947. And it stayed there till 1962. They bought out United Food Market, moved to the new building United Food Market built, where the parking lot Hy-Vee is now. There was a fire in 1964, and they moved back to their old location until they could repair the fire damage later that year, and then moved back to 107 North Fillmore Street. Stayed there till 1992, when they moved into the old Don's Airliner building, which seemed huge back then and doesn't now, but then moved to their new building in 2019? 21? 2019.
Back to 19, right?
Yeah.
it's
I think it was March 9th, 2019. By the way, I was the second customer ever in that store. Kevin Dessinger. I was taking pictures. Kevin Dessinger shows up, starts walking around the parking lot, and I said, "Hey, you go in first, I'll be number 2. And this is a funny story. They unlock the door, 7 a.m. is when they open. And Kevin walks in, and I walk in behind him. There's about 20 employees who start doing this. And this is what I said to Kevin. I said, "Kevin, all this is applause for you, because I'm not that important." So I was store customer number 2. I'll tell you just some other information I picked up. Mount Air had an A&P store for 1 year, not even a full year. It was 1928. A&P stood for the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. And at that time, 1928, A&P was the largest retailer in the world. And they had a store in Mount Air for 1 year, February 28 to December 28. I mentioned Piggly Wiggly. Piggly Wiggly revolutionized the grocery store business in 1916. Self-serve shopping. Prior to that, you gave your list to the clerk. Here's what I want, and the clerk went and got it. You didn't walk up and down aisles. You didn't have a basket or a cart. The clerk did it all for you. And sometime shortly after that, Piggly Wiggly introduced the shopping cart. So, thank you, Piggly Wiggly. We had a lot of successful grocers in Mount Air. Probably the most successful was H.H. Wilson. He built the building where Morgan Waldire is now. I think it's 112 West Madison Street. He had that built in 1891, and he was very successful. He dealt in groceries, grain, real estate. He was extremely wealthy. His son was Frank Wilson, the attorney, and H.H. Wilson built the second house on Shellway Drive. It's the brick one, the Joe Ralph house. He had that built in 1914-15. I think they moved in February 1915. And it's big and beautiful, but it's brick. The first 3 houses built out there, 2 were wood, 1 was brick. And he owned a lot of land. He started working hard young and amassed some wealth and was able to make that into greater wealth and just made good decisions. And so he's probably the most successful grocer we ever had. Probably in the line of products, Fatty Collins, his real name was Amos. His nickname was Fatty, and he was a baker. And he turned his bakery into a restaurant, so he sold bread and cakes and pies and groceries, and then he opened a restaurant. He was the first one that I know of to have Coca-Cola in Mount Air on fountain service. And if it was, he sold the products that people like, donuts and Coca-Cola. So as he got older, he tried to sell his business. He tried to lease it out. People would lease it. He would remain on as baker because he was a master baker. But the people that would lease it would give it back. And he died about 1933, 35. But he was in business in Mount Air. He came in 1881 as the cook to the Ellis House Hotel, which burned in 1889. But I think he left before that, started his own bakery. And he was a 50-year businessman in Mount Air, and people knew him and liked him. And he had one daughter, and I don't know where she moved to, but I read all these names and I go, well, where's that family today? Well, they're not here. I don't have any descendants either. So, you think, wait a minute, this county used to be crawling with people named Holland, and they're all gone. Skinner, where are they? I go, wait a minute, bring them back. Maybe that's how a historian thinks, but I just read the old newspapers and go, man, there was 6 barber shops in Mount Air. I know we got, and Dick's house not real great either, so Dick's been there 59 years now.
And he's there at 6:15 every morning.
Yeah. Thomas Liggett was another successful grocer. He built the building where Dean's Jacob Spur House is. He built that in 1891, and it was 2-story at the time. It's now 3-story. But Dean Jacobs, there was a fire. Dean Jacobs bought the building and rebuilt it as a 3-story building. In the old days, they would make the ceilings 12, 14 feet high. So Dean was able to reuse the same sidewalls. He just shortened the ceiling and made it 3 stories. They put in an elevator, and I sold my fur to Dean when I was a kid. Me and Vern Millsap would go check our traps before school, and if we caught anything, then we had money and we weren't going to school. That's the way that worked. One morning, I don't know, Vern wasn't with me, or it was my own trap. I had 1 possum, that's all I had. And I went into Dean Jacobs, and he said, I'll give you 10 cents for it. And that was a bottle of pop, and I knew possums weren't good. I go, okay, I'll take it. He reaches in his pocket, and he had 2 quarters and 2 pennies. He says, have you got change for a quarter? No. I ended up getting a quarter for that possum. So I like to tell I pulled a fast one on Dean Jacobs. But Thomas Liggett built that building, and it was his sons that bought H.H. Wilson's grocery store. Their names were Harry and Arthur Liggett, and they ran H.H. Wilson's grocery store for 20 years after H.H. Wilson retired. And they were very successful. And then Harry and his wife went and opened a grocery store in Diagonal in the 50s before they retired. So, you know, and Mount Air had 100 grocery stores that lasted less than a year and you never saw them again. And there were a lot of fires in the old days. There was a grocery store where the Princess Theater is, there was a big fire in November 1985. Took out a grocery store there. And all those, the Princess Theater was built the next year in 1886 by William Tempe. But there's just so many fires before 1900 when just about everything started getting built brick. And it's just, if you want to get into the digitized newspapers, that word search feature really makes it easy. But you can't type in what you have to use the language of the day. I'll give you an example. The word post office is 2 words, but 120 years ago it was 1 word. And schoolhouse might have been 2 words back then, now it's 1 word. Also, if you're looking up drinking establishment, you have to type in saloon. You can't type in tavern or bar or beer parlor. Those came later. So the language of the day, it helps to know. If I want to look up the Mount Air Depot, I don't type in Mount Air Depot. I type in depot at Mount Air. And sometimes they'll use depot in Mount Air. But it's funny how little detail you get out of the old, especially the correspondence, the people that mailed in information. I read about a dedication of a church in Kellerton in 1885, 84, and it didn't even give the name of the church.
Oh.
And I thought about that for a couple of years, and I thought, okay, it was common knowledge which church was being dedicated. It turned out to be the Christian church. By the way, the very first church ever built in Kellerton was a Catholic church, 1883. Christian, 1884, and Methodist, 1885. Although the Methodists didn't have their dedication until 2 years later. And I don't know what happened to pastors, if they died, if they moved away, got a different job, I don't know. But they built a church and not have a dedication until 2 years later. And you just wonder, the more you know, the more you want to know. And so I did kind of question whether I had the right information on that particular subject. And then I got some papers from Dick Jackson and Camille, and some woman had written her memories of the early Methodist church in Kellerton, and she said, we had church service in 1886, but there were no pews and no heat, and we had to wear our winter clothes inside. So the church got enclosed, the outside got built, but the inside didn't get furnished. There wasn't any pastor until the fall of 86. Then they had the dedication in the spring of 87, which was pretty common to have dedications in the spring because you didn't want to try it in the winter. So if you just keep looking, you eventually find what you're looking for. Sometimes it takes a while, but having the newspaper digitized is, man, that's a lifesaver. Because before, you're just surfing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Now, that sounds stupid, and it is, but after a while you get to know that the ads are in the same place. And you can see an ad out of the corner of your eye, but you don't have to go to it because you know what it is. And then you know that a certain page has the local news and a certain page has the national news. They have condensed books. There's a lot you can skip, is what I'm saying. And then the want ads usually wasn't too much in there. But looking back in the old days, that started in 1936. So that takes you back 50 years to 1886, which is good because those 1886 newspapers are a little rough, hard to read. So after you do it for a few years, you learn a few tricks that help you along. Any questions?
Yeah, when you talk about the, RLDS and the